Hi, it's Miss Morgan. I'm going to do my best to give you information that's helpful for the Chapter 7 test. So you should have a piece of paper in front of you, writing down some facts, 10 facts that relate to the information presented in the video. You can always write more. So just want to reinforce that the name of this time period, there's a bunch of different names, and they're all listed there. Middle Ages is that name comes from this time period being between ancient times, like the Romans and Greeks, and modern times, starting around the Renaissance. And the word medieval has Latin roots, in case you take Latin. If I go too fast and you want to write something down and you're watching this on your own, you can press pause, rewind, catch up with what you want to write, move on, whatever's going to work best. A lot of people have said that they get confused between Clovis, Charles Martel, and Charlemagne, and they all look similar. They all have names that start with C. So here's what I thought of to help you distinguish the three men. Clovis, if you look at his name, I highlighted the C, the O, and the V, and he's the one who converted to Christianity. So converted also has C, O, and V. He did this because he had conquered Gaul, which was a former Roman province, and he got the support of the people of Gaul, and he also earned the Pope as an ally when he converted to Christianity. So this was a smart move for him. So that's my best way to try to help you remember Clovis. For Charles Martel, if you see his name, I made the T bigger in his last name, made it red. Charles Martel is the one who led the Christians in the Battle of Tours. So the T in his last name goes with the T in Tours. So he was part of the Franks who were Christians. So I just wanted to remind you of that in case you forgot. And Christians and Franks are the same thing at this point. Charles Martel with the T led the Christians in the Battle of Tours. So also some good information about the Battle of Tours. It was Christians versus the Muslims, the Franks versus the Muslims, same thing, Franks are Christians. Christians were victorious. It happened in France. Also, Christians thought because they won, it meant God was on their side. However, at the same time, they were still worried because Muslims had land in Spain and controlled that. So the Muslims were in Europe and had land in Europe because Spain is in Europe. And so the Christians were still nervous about the Muslim presence because they were close enough that they could threaten the Christians one day. They never actually did, but the Christians didn't like the fact that Muslims had control of land in Europe. So moving on to Charlemagne, I couldn't think of anything clever to help you remember what Charlemagne did. So I'm just going to review what he did. He was known as the greatest king of the Middle Ages. He helped unite Europe around 800, so that was a big deal because a lot of Europe hadn't been united for so long. He wanted to bring back Latin learning in his kingdom, and he stressed education. So in your review, there were some questions on one of the sheets about why Charlemagne encouraged education, what he wanted his officials to do. So you should make sure you're familiar with that information. And like, what did he leave behind? What was his legacy? He had helped spread Christianity, and he was also known for creating strong governments. So that was what, once he died, what he was known for, some of what he was known for. Anyway, Vikings. So I just want to point out that the Vikings had some positive things that they did and negative. So they're usually known for the negative, but the positive is that they were good at trading and exploring. So they set up a colony in North America. They created trade routes between Northern Europe and the Mediterranean lands. And for the negative, they looted and burned a lot of places on Europe's coasts and rivers. And they were from Scandinavia, which is today Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. So they're more known for the negative than positive, but they did do a little of both. So they connect to why feudalism ever developed in the first place. And this is a really important topic because it was around for hundreds of years in Europe. So I think it's important to know why they even ever have it. So the first thing was the invaders, like the Muslims, Vikings, and Magyars. So they were invading Europe, and because the Roman Empire had united Europe, but the Roman Empire, at least the western part, was done. So Europe was a little more chaotic because of that. Anyway, so you have these invaders, and the emperors at the time were too weak to do anything about the invasions. So it wouldn't have been as big of a deal if the emperors had been able to stop the invaders, but they couldn't. So that led them to create feudalism, because feudalism, people needed protection for their land, for themselves, and for their homes. And it's a peasant home. People needed protection, and feudalism gave them the protection that they needed. So just as a review, invaders like Muslims and Vikings were invading Europe. The emperors were too weak to do anything about the invasions and stop them, and people needed protection for their home, land, and themselves. Anyway, so speaking of feudalism, I just want to remind you that the manors were self-sufficient, and they produced almost everything that they needed to live on the manors. That included food, clothing, furniture, tools, but they didn't really need to leave the manor too much, at least at this point in history. And so because everything that they needed was produced on the manor. Part of the review you may have thought of the advantages or disadvantages of feudalism. So it kind of depends on your social class. Obviously, if you're towards the top, a monarch or a lord or noble, lords and nobles are the same thing, by the way. If you're towards the top, it's a great system. People are born into the social class and you can't change it. So if you're at the top forever. If you're at the bottom, however, if you're a peasant, then a disadvantage is that you can't change your social class in feudalism. So that makes, that's, you kind of have a stinky life from start to finish. All right, everyone gets protection, so that's good. Another tricky thing or disadvantage would be if vassals had more than one lord that they were loyal to, that they owed loyalty to, and those lords fought, then things could kind of get complicated with the lords and vassals. Because remember, vassals are below lords. Lords are known as lords because they give away some of their land to vassals to control. Anyway, so if two lords fought, then it could be confusing if a vassal owed loyalty to both of them. So, and I guess another advantage would be that everyone gets what they need because the manor can produce everything and is self-sufficient. So an important part of this chapter was the medieval church. So I just want to remind you the medieval church and the Catholic Church are the same thing at this time period. One thing I just want to make sure I go over are the church's views on women. In God's eyes, they believed that God thought men and women were equal, but on earth, women were Women were weak and easily led to sin, and they needed men to help them avoid sin. So that was something that the church believed was true about women on earth in their earthly lives. The church wanted to limit education of nuns and women because they just wanted women to accept the authority of the church, and they didn't want nuns to have too much power. So next up, I have a topic of anti-Semitism. So this is prejudice against Jews. It increased in Europe because over time, a lot of Europeans became Christian and Christianity spread throughout Europe. So that's when anti-Semitism increased and kind of stayed for a long time, forever, basically. Anyway, because Christians didn't understand the Jewish culture and religion, and they didn't have scientific explanations for things like famine or illness, they would blame Jews. And also, they did not allow Jews to own land in some places or have certain jobs. Because of all this persecution and mistreatment, a lot of Jews migrated or moved to Eastern Europe. They were in Western Europe and they moved to Eastern Europe. So, coming out of the Dark Ages, throughout the Middle Ages, things did improve, and one way they improved was with better agriculture and farming. So there were new technological developments that allowed there to be more farmland in Europe. This led to more food being produced and a higher population because there was more food, so a higher population could be sustained and people could live longer, and the population over time basically tripled from 25 million to 70 million people in Europe. So I just want to go back. I think I have time to explain some of the technological improvements for farming. You had a new harness that could use horses instead of oxen, and that made it faster to plow fields, and you could create more farmland. And there was a 3-field system and iron plows, and they also cleared forests, drained swamps, and reclaimed wasteland so that it could become farming land. Moving on, and coming out of the Dark Ages also occurred because there was improved trade and travel. So over time, feudal warfare and foreign invasions declined, so it was safer to travel and trade. Wealthy nobles began to want goods that could not be made on the manors, and so trade picked up for that reason. There was lots of trade fairs, and people settled in the towns where the trade fairs occurred when it was wintertime, and it was hard to travel, and eventually these centers of trade became the first medieval cities. So that's why improved travel and trade happened, and then as a result it led to the centers of trade becoming the first medieval cities. And that's where charters come into play, so you should make sure you're familiar with what charters do. Okay, coming out of the Dark Ages also happened because of improved business, and some examples of that are the use of partnerships, insurance, and bills of exchange. So you want to make sure that you understand the benefits of a partnership. It relates to having more money available to start the business, and then there's less risk involved because you're not putting all your money into starting the business. So if the business fails, you don't lose as much money. Okay, so that's a benefit of partnerships. Benefit of insurance is a merchant can pay an underwriter a small fee, and if the shipment gets damaged or destroyed or lost, if the merchant's shipment, if that's what happens to it, then the merchant can get some of the shipment's value because they had purchased the insurance. And lastly, a bill of exchange. This is where you give money to your bank wherever you're from. You get a bill of exchange, which is a piece of paper. You go somewhere else. You go to a different bank, wherever that somewhere else is. You give them your bill of exchange, and they give you coins back. They give you money back in another city. So the merchant doesn't have to travel with gold coins, which are easy to steal, and they're not as, obviously a piece of paper is not as bulky as coins. Lastly, coming out of the Dark Ages happened for Europe because life improved for peasants. And lords wanted money because they wanted to buy those goods that couldn't be made on the manor. So they were willing to not have peasants be tied to them for life anymore, but for peasants to become tenant farmers. So the lord lent peasants land to farm, and then the peasants would farm the land, sell the farm goods, and then would need to give some of that money to the lord because they're renting farmland from the lord. But then peasants also have money for themselves a little bit. So this is what loosens feudalism and loosens the ties between peasants and lords. There are some other causes that feudalism loosens up a little bit. We'll study those in another chapter. But life improves for at least the peasants, and the lords get the money they want, and they're able to buy the goods that they want. So they're happy, and peasants are happy because they don't owe a lifetime of service to the lords anymore. All right, that sums it up. I'm almost out of time anyway. I'm sure if Mr. Walsh still worked at our school, he would wish you good luck for the test. I wish you good luck, and you can always re-listen to the video or watch it on your own if that might be helpful. And I hope you do a great job on the test.